Dinuba Presbyterian Church, and welcome back to our online video Bible study series. It's Advent season, so we're taking a look at famous Christmas carols that we often sing during Christmas time and seeing how they can help illuminate the story of Jesus' birth that we read about in the Scriptures. We are halfway through Advent already, if you can believe it. It is really flying by. So as a bit of housekeeping, we have 2 weeks left in this series, today and next week. And then after that, during the week of Sunday, December 27th, we're going to take a break for 1 week. So there's not going to be any study that week between Christmas and New Year's. But the week of January 3rd, that first Sunday in 2021, we will start a new series, which we'll briefly preview next week when you come back. So that's all the housekeeping. So with that said, let's move on to this week's Christmas carol. I can almost guarantee that you don't know all the words to the carol that we're studying this week. In fact, I only knew the first 2 lines of this carol when I started the research that eventually developed into this study. And that's kind of a shame, because the history and the important message behind our carol this week is born out of a tale of religious warfare and palace intrigue, a feuding mother and daughter-in-law, and not 1, but 2 brazen political assassinations. It's a tale that has been passed down to us in the form of the carol, Good King Wenceslas. But who was Wenceslas? What was he king of? In what way was he good? Well, to find out, we once again have to jump backwards in time a little over 1,000 years, right around the time when the O antiphons that we studied last week were starting to emerge. And we have to go to Eastern Europe and the Kingdom of Bohemia, which is now inside the modern nation-state of the Czech Republic. The spread of Christianity from Jerusalem and out to the wider world was a much slower process than we often think about, since we live in such an interconnected world with very rapid information exchange and communication. The church really struggled to evangelize the Slavic peoples of Eastern Europe for a number of cultural and linguistic reasons, but eventually in the 9th century a big breakthrough occurred when the ruler of Bohemia, Prince Rastislav, followed in his father Borovaj's footsteps and converted to Christianity. He implored church officials in the city of Constantinople, of course that's Istanbul nowadays, to send missionaries who could assist him in promoting this new Christian belief among his people. The church commissioned 2 brothers named Cyril and Methodius to accomplish this goal, based on their earlier success with a people group known as the Khazars, who lived north of the Black Sea. Cyril and Methodius received permission from the church to begin holding the Mass, that is church services, in the Slavic language of the Bohemian people, instead of in the traditional Latin language. And in order to make the Scriptures available to the Slavs, the 2 brothers set about the creation of a new written language that we call Cyrillic today, named after St. Cyril, and that of course is the alphabet used by the Russian language to this day. Radislav's mother, Ludmilla, was a devoted Christian who had built the very first church in Bohemia, near Prague. But when her husband Borovaj died, politics demanded that the royal family maintain a good relationship with the non-Christian elements of Bohemia, and to that end, Rastislav married a pagan woman named Drahomira, and who had absolutely no interest in the Christian faith. Radislav and Drahomira had 2 sons. The younger they named Boleslav, and the older they named Wenceslas. Ludmilla wanted to raise Wenceslas as a Christian. Drahomira had exactly the opposite view. Radislav died when Wenceslas was a child, and because he was not of sufficient age yet to ascend the throne, Ludmilla became regent, and she exercised her authority to ensure that Wenceslas was instructed in the faith. Drahomira did not take this lying down, to say the least, and so this was not ever conclusively proven, but most historians believe that she hired the men who broke into Ludmilla's house during the night and strangled her to death. With Ludmilla out of the way, Drahomira ascended to the regency until Wenceslas came of age and assumed the throne as Prince of Bohemia in 924 AD. Wenceslas's ascension was believed to be a political compromise that both sides of a raging culture war in the area could support. For the Christians, he was the grandson of the famously devout Ludmilla, and for the pagans, he was the son of the fiercely pagan Drahomira. He belonged to both of these groups, it was thought, and thus he could bring about a reasonable stalemate, if not true peace. But much to his mother's dismay, Wenceslas had been significantly shaped and molded by the teaching of his grandmother, and like his father and his grandfather before him, he acted as a Christian monarch. It's believed he vowed never to marry, and when Christian missionaries from nearby Germany arrived in Bohemia to start evangelizing, Wenceslas welcomed them, and he supported their efforts inside Bohemia, despite the looming threat of German invasion of the whole country. Seeking to keep the peace and prevent a destructive war, Wenceslas had made a peace deal with the German king, Henry I the Fowler, that subordinated Bohemia to its German enemies, and this enraged the royal court. It's at this point that Wenceslas's brother, Boleslav, re-enters the story. He lacked Wenceslas's devotion and character, and he was easily persuaded by the powerful non-Christian elements of the royal court to move against his brother. On Sunday morning, the 28th of December, 929 AD, Boleslav and his men-at-arms fell upon Wenceslas as he was ascending the steps of his church to go to Mass. He was stabbed to death just outside the church door. Wenceslas had reigned for less than 5 years, and he died at the age of 22. He was quickly recognized by the church as the patron saint of Bohemia, and his legend quickly began to spread and grow in magnitude throughout Europe. There were even reports of miracles happening at the tomb where he was buried, as much as 3 years after he had been buried there. And Boleslav tried to quash this burgeoning popular movement recognizing Wenceslas as a saint by moving Wenceslas' body to a church in Prague. This had absolutely no effect on this rising popularity and on the legend of Wenceslas in the hearts and the imaginations of Christian people. And over the next several hundred years, this new burial site became a popular destination for pilgrims. But why was Wenceslas so beloved and so revered? Just what was so good about him? Well, the answer appears to be just about everything. He regularly distributed food and wine and firewood to the desperately poor in his dukedom to stave off hunger and freezing cold. He spent time in both orphanages and prisons, providing resources and encouraging the dispossessed. Wenceslas, as far as we could tell, was dedicated to living the way that Jesus had lived on earth. A lot of his activity in his short life is reminiscent of the passage that Jesus read from Isaiah when he kicked off his public ministry in a synagogue in Nazareth. Luke writes, "And he," that is Jesus, "came to Nazareth, where he had been brought up. And as was his custom, he went to the synagogue on the Sabbath day, and he stood up to read. And the scroll of the prophet Isaiah was given to him. He unrolled the scroll and found the place where it was written, 'The Spirit of the Lord is upon me, because he has anointed me to proclaim good news to the poor. He has sent me to proclaim liberty to the captives, and recovering of sight to the blind, to set at liberty those who are oppressed, to proclaim the year of the Lord's favor.'" Now, as what happens on a lot of occasions in Jesus' ministry, his teaching and this direct challenge to the religious leaders of Israel caused nothing short of a riot with the intent to kill Jesus. In fact, very shortly after he says this, a mob forms and tries to push him off of a cliff to kill him. But Jesus escapes. It is not yet his time. Jesus' time would come eventually, and he would be put to death on a cross for a variety of reasons. The Romans feared he could spark insurrection against the empire, draining military resources and disrupting important trade routes with Egypt. The Jewish religious leaders feared that he would spark revolution within Judaism and take the people away from the Sadducees and the Pharisees. But most importantly, God intended to accept the perfect sacrifice of Jesus on the cross on our behalf, then free us from our slavery to sin. All of these reasons are true, and it's true that in the case of the good Prince Wenceslas, his devotion to Christian love and charity in his life rankled the political and pagan religious elites of his time and caused them to kill him. Wenceslas's new way of believing, and especially his new way of acting, made him much beloved among the people, but made him despised among his enemies. Despite his death at such a young age, the example of Wenceslas was preserved in many poems and verses in several different languages throughout Europe, verses which eventually found their way into the English language when John Mason Neale crafted a version in our language in the 19th century and tied it to a medieval melody that was written, we believe, sometime in the 13th century. This has become our modern hymn of Good King Wenceslas. Unlike so many other carols that we sing or that we hear during Christmas time, there is no mention of the nativity story of Jesus' birth within this carol. There are no angels, no shepherds, no Mary and Joseph traveling to Bethlehem. But the history of Wenceslas' life and the setting of the carol's story on the Feast of Stephen do connect it to Christianity and to the Advent season. The Feast of Stephen, one of the famous martyrs of the early church, who we meet in Acts chapter 6 and 7, is celebrated on December 26th, the day after Christmas. In English tradition, December 26th is known as Boxing Day, and you may actually see some commercially produced calendars still to this day that label December 26th with this title. Boxing Day is a celebration of charitable giving, with a particular emphasis on the landed nobility and gentry giving gifts to their household servants. Those who had received abundant material blessing were expected to give generously to those who had not experienced the same level of blessing in their own lives. This is the message of Good King Wenceslas, which depicts the famous generosity of this prince and encourages the reader to follow in his example. The entire text reads, Good King Wenceslas looked out on the feast of Stephen, when the snow lay round about, deep and crisp and even. Brightly shone the moon that night, though the frost was cruel, when a poor man came in sight, gathering winter fuel. Hither, page, and stand by me, if thou knowest telling, yonder peasant, who is he? Where and what his dwelling? Sire, he lives a good league hence, underneath the mountain, right against the forest fence, by St. Agnes' fountain. Bring me flesh, and bring me wine, bring me pine logs hither. Thou and I shall see him dine, when we bear them thither. Page and monarch, forth they went together, through the rude wind's wild lament, and the bitter weather. Sire, the night is darker now, and the wind blows stronger. Fails my heart, I know not how, I can go no longer. Mark my footsteps, good my page, tread thou in them boldly. Thou shalt find the winter's rage freeze thy blood less coldly. In his master's steps he trod, where the snow lay dinted. Heat was in the very sod which the saint had printed. Therefore, Christian men, be sure, wealth or rank possessing, ye who now will bless the poor, shall yourselves find blessing. Christmas is a story about giving. God gave of himself in his Son Jesus, who did not prize the glory and beauty and perfect peace of heaven over our plight as sinful, fallen people unable to help ourselves. Jesus came to earth experiencing the helplessness of being a baby and the chaos of being a person in the first century world to give us this greatest gift, reconciliation with God and a path back to the Father that will never be closed. Wenceslas followed after this example. And in this season of Advent, we are called to follow in the footsteps of our good King. Next week, we'll wrap up this series of studies on Christmas carols, and then we'll take our Christmas break the week after that. I'm sure we all need it, but I look forward to seeing you next week. Until then, the Lord bless you. Merry Christmas, and we'll see you again next time.